The desert sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty plains of the Arizona Territory. Beatrix Sutter's heart hammered in her chest as she kicked her mare into a desperate gallop. She had never ridden so hard in her life, never been so terrified. The echo of gunfire exploded behind her, and a burning sensation ripped across her shoulder. Her body lurched. She clung to the saddle horn, refusing to abandon hope. A single thought kept her alive escape. Somewhere in these merciless badlands lay a man she had never met, but who would hold her fate in his weathered hands. Beatrix Sutter had never believed her life would take such a terrifying turn. In the early hours before dawn, she had crept out of the small bedroom she shared with her husband, Clayton Sutter, and tiptoed down the hall, wincing at every creak in the floorboards. Her mind was filled with the grim acceptance that tonight would be the night she would finally break free from a prison disguised as a marriage. Clayton had once shown her kindness, however fleeting. They'd met at a church social in the newly formed town of Mesquite Bend, near the edges of the Arizona Territory. He had seemed charming, well-mannered, and dedicated to building a prosperous life out west. Beatrix, who'd grown up on her family's modest farm, was attracted to his ambition. But as the months dragged on, as the wagon wheels of their westward dreams turned, she realized that behind his polite facade lurked a cruel streak. The words he used to break her down were sharper than any Bowie knife. A chair scraped on the wooden floor in the parlor, startling Beatrix. For an agonizing moment, she feared Clayton was still awake, polishing his revolver, or studying some business ledger by the oil lamp. She froze, clutching her small satchel containing the only items of value she had left. A few worn clothes, an heirloom pocket watch from her deceased mother, and a handful of silver dollars she'd secreted away over the last year. Silence. She continued slipping out the back door. In the moonlight, she caught sight of her reflection in a rain barrel, wide eyes, face pale, deep circles of exhaustion. Beatrix's hair, once neatly pinned, now hung loose in disarray. She barely recognized herself, but she couldn't let fear stop her now. At the corral, she found her mare, Daisy. She gently patted the horse's nose to calm her. Daisy tossed her head as Beatrix untied the reins, her nostrils flaring with the excitement of an unexpected ride. The ranch yard was eerily still. The hush of night magnified every sound, the squeak of the leather saddle, the crunch of gravel under the mare's hooves. Beatrix lifted a trembling foot into the stirrup and pulled herself up. She whispered a silent prayer that she could make it to the next counter, maybe even to the edges of civilization, far from Clayton's reach. But that fleeting hope dissolved the moment she heard his enraged shout echo through the dark. A gunshot cracked like thunder. Daisy reared, nearly toppling Beatrix from the saddle, but she clung on. Pain seared her shoulder. She cried out, tears springing to her eyes, yet she forced herself to press forward. Clayton's curses reverberated through the yard, mingling with Daisy's panicked whinnies. Another shot blasted. A bullet whizzed by, close enough that Beatrix felt the sting of gunpowder in the air. She dug her heels into Daisy's flanks and galloped into the night, leaving behind her home, her past, and everything she once believed about love. She needed to lose herself in the expanse of the desert, find cover, or somewhere safe. The flickering lights of Mesquite Bend were miles away. The nearest outpost of any significance was the famous city of Tombstone, a place that had earned a wicked reputation after the gunfight at the OK Corral only a few years prior. She had no real plan, only the primal instinct to flee. Riding at breakneck speed, Half dazed from blood loss, Beatrix cast one last glance over her shoulder. The figure chasing her was just a shadow in the moonlight, but she didn't need to see his face to know who it was. If Clayton caught her, she wouldn't survive the night. The desert night swallowed Beatrix and Daisy as they raced beyond the boundary of the ranch. The open terrain provided no real sanctuary. Low mesquite bushes and sparse cacti dotted the land, their shapes twisted and menacing under the moon's uncertain glow. Every few yards, a jagged outcrop of rock or dried gulch threatened to trip the mare if she took a misstep. Her wounded shoulder throbbed with each hoofbeat. She felt the warm trickle of blood soaking into her blouse, but adrenaline kept her focused. Her mind flashed to the stories she'd heard in Mesquite Bend Ranch, hands talking about outlaws, drifters, even Apache scouts who roamed the deserts at night. She had prayed for a savior, but all she found was a vast wilderness that reflected her desperation. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had lost all meaning in her terror. She reined Daisy behind a cluster of rocks, panting as if she'd run the distance herself. Reaching up to her shoulder, she probed the wound with shaky fingers. The bullet had grazed her slicing flesh, but apparently not lodging in bone. Still, the pain was fierce, and she realized she might bleed to death if she didn't find help. In the distance, faint lights shone, maybe ranch lights or a solitary homestead's lantern. Mesquite Bend was to the northeast. Those lights seemed to lie directly west. She needed to decide which direction offered safety. Mesquite Bend had decent folk, but it was also a place where Clayton held power. He was well liked among some of the business owners and boasted enough influence that no one would question his authority over his wife. No, Beatrix told herself that wasn't an option. West it was. She clucked her tongue at Daisy and urged the mare forward. They hadn't gone far when her body betrayed her. Dizzy from pain and shock, she slumped in the saddle. She tried to rally, but her vision blurred. The mesquite trees swam before her eyes. Suddenly the ground rushed up to meet her. She collapsed in a swirl of dust, the jolt shaking her bones. Daisy nickered and stomped anxiously near her fallen rider. Beatrix fought to remain conscious. She pressed a hand to her bleeding shoulder, forcing herself to push through the pain. But blackness clouded her vision. She felt a strange sense of floating, as if the desert floor had become water pulling her under. When she regained a flicker of awareness, she glimpsed a figure bending over her. A tall man, broad-shouldered and hatted against the moonlight, was kneeling with a canteen of water in one hand. Was he friend or foe? She tried to push him away, but her limbs were too weak. Easy. She heard a deep voice say, "You're hurt." She parted her lips, but couldn't speak. The last thing she remembered was the taste of lukewarm water dribbling down her parched throat as strong arms scooped her up. The sense of safety she felt, however fleeting, was enough to let the darkness claim her once again. Sunlight streamed through the windows when Beatrix opened her eyes again. She jolted, unsure of her surroundings, until the throbbing in her shoulder reminded her of everything that had happened. She looked around. The room was cozy, but definitely part of a ranch house. She lay on a small bed covered in a well-worn quilt. The walls were plain wood, decorated with a single shelf of books, a couple of framed sketches, and a silver horseshoe nailed above the door for luck. Her first thought was, "I've been caught." Clayton must have found her and dragged her back. But then she noticed the tray on the bedside table, a bowl of steaming broth and a cup of tea. Clayton would never have bothered. Suddenly a door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, with sandy brown hair curling beneath a wide-brimmed hat, he held in his hands. His angular face was softened by a gentle concern in his eyes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, as if trying not to spook her. "I see you're awake." Beatrix instinctively pulled the blanket up, trying to shield herself. "Who are you?" she croaked, her throat still raw. He set his hat on a peg and approached carefully. "Name's Owen Barnett. This here's my ranch." He gestured vaguely around them. "Found you out on my south range, unconscious. You were bleedin' bad, so I brought you in." He sat on the edge of a wooden chair near the bed. Though his posture was calm, Beatrix sensed an undercurrent of tension, as if he were afraid she might try to bolt. "Thank you," she managed. Panic began to swirl in her mind again. "I'm sorry to impose. I just—" She couldn't bring herself to explain everything yet. The shame of her situation pressed on her chest like a weight. Owen frowned. "You had a bullet graze on your shoulder. I cleaned it as best I could. Might leave a scar, but I reckon you'll heal fine." Beatrix's gaze drifted to the bandage peeking beneath the neckline of her borrowed nightgown. You dressed my wound." He nodded, his cheeks reddening slightly. "Had to. And got you into some fresh clothes. My sister's old nightgown. She passed on a few years back, God rest her soul." Emotions roiled inside her. Gratitude, embarrassment, and a lingering terror of what might happen if Clayton came for her. "You must think me a fool," she whispered, eyes downcast. Owen shook his head. "I don't know what you've been through, but I'd guess you didn't get that bullet wound by accident." They were both silent for a moment. Beatrix noticed the faint lines around his eyes, possibly from years of squinting against the desert sun. He didn't press her for answers. Instead, he just shifted in his seat and offered a gentle smile. "I made some soup," he said. "Can you eat?" Her stomach clenched with hunger at the aroma. She nodded gratefully, and he handed her the bowl. The warmth of the soup soothed her, and for a moment she savored the simple luxury of a hot meal. As she ate, he spoke quietly. "I've got some supplies if you need to change that bandage. Don't want an infection setting in. We're a fair piece from any doctor." She paused. "Where am I?" "My ranch is about 15 miles west of Mesquite Bend. I raise cattle here. Called it the Barnett Spread. Been here about 5 years now. Old man Travers to the north is my nearest neighbor." Mesquite Bend. The name alone made her flinch. That meant Clayton was not too far away. "I'm sorry. I won't stay long," she said, feeling tears threaten. "I just need—" Owen quickly shook his head. "You've lost blood, and the desert's no place for a wounded traveler. You'll stay as long as you need to recover." His generosity was startling. Beatrix studied him warily, searching for any hint of the cruelty she'd come to associate with men. But all she saw was earnest concern. She gulped a spoonful of broth, the heat stinging her throat. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. He pressed his lips together. "Sometimes folks need a hand. That's all." Beatrix lowered her spoon, her eyes brimming with tears. She hated crying in front of a stranger, but the floodgates of relief opened. She'd gone so long without a shred of real kindness that this simple offer of help felt overwhelming. Owen cleared his throat and averted his gaze, respecting her moment of vulnerability. "I'll let you get some rest. Holler if you need anything." He stood and made to leave. She found the words tumbling out of her mouth. "Thank you." His gaze lingered on her for a second, conveying a softness that made her heart twist in confusion. "You're welcome," he said, and slipped out the door, leaving her alone with the quiet hum of hope she hadn't felt in years. Over the next few days, Beatrix regained enough strength to move about Owen's small ranch house. True to his word, he asked no questions, content to let her heal. She spent her days resting, changing her bandage, and helping in small ways, tidying the kitchen, sweeping the porch, or feeding the stray cat that prowled around the yard. Nights were the hardest. Sleep was restless, haunted by nightmares of Clayton's rage. More than once she woke with a cry, only to realize she was safe, not pinned under her husband's controlling hand. On the 5th evening after the sun dipped below the western sky, she found Owen in the modest living area. He was reading an old book of poetry by lamplight. She hovered by the doorway, uncertain if she should disturb him. "You can come in," he said gently, not looking up from the page. She stepped inside, folding her hands to steady her nerves. "I'm not interrupting, no." He closed the book, marking his place with a strip of leather. "Did you need something?" She sank onto a small wooden stool facing the fireplace, which still held the last flickers of a dying blaze. I just wanted some company. Hard to sleep." He nodded as if he understood. "Sometimes the nights feel longer than the days out here." Beatrix picked at the fabric of her borrowed nightgown. "You must wonder about me. Why I was out there shot and alone." Owen leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It crossed my mind. But it's your story to tell." A heavy silence fell. She glanced at him, noticing the compassion in his eyes. It was enough to give her courage. "My husband," she began, her voice trembling, he's not a good man. I had to escape. That night." Her hand drifted to her bandaged shoulder. "He fired on me, shot me as I was fleeing." Owen's brow furrowed, a flash of anger in his eyes. "Your own husband did that?" She nodded, tears gathering. "Clayton Sutter. He's a rancher outside Mesquite Bend. He can be charming in public, but behind closed doors." She stopped, swallowing the bitter memories. "He controlled every aspect of my life, became crueler by the day. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I snuck out that night, hoping to reach safety before he noticed." The words tumbled out, unstoppable now that she'd started. She told Owen of the daily torment, the bruises hidden beneath her clothing, the financial manipulations, and the emotional battering that left her self-worth in tatters. She recounted how Clayton used his standing in town to ensure no one questioned him, how she had grown to fear the sound of his footsteps in the hall. Owen listened without interruption. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists on his knees. When she finished, he lifted his gaze, eyes glistening with empathy. "You ain't gotta go back," he said quietly. Beatrix exhaled a shaky breath. "He'll come looking. I know him. He won't rest until he finds me." Owen stared into the dying fire for a moment. "Folks might say it's none of my business, but no man should get away with treating his wife like that. If he comes here, I won't let him hurt you." Her heart fluttered in her chest. "But you don't understand. He has influence. If he accuses you of hiding me, I'll face that if it happens." Owen stood. He moved toward her, though not so close as to alarm her. "You're safe as long as you want to be, miss." A painful smile twisted her lips. "Sutter. Beatrix Sutter." He pursed his lips. "Beatrix. That's a pretty name. You can stay if you like. And if you'd rather not keep the name Sutter, that's fine, too. I can introduce you in town as a cousin or a friend or... Well, it's up to you. But you've got a place here for as long as you need. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. In that moment, the warmth in his gaze seemed to be the only light in her darkness. As the weeks went on, Beatrix found herself easing into a routine at the Barnett Ranch. Mornings began with feeding the horses, collecting eggs from the chicken coop, and tidying the small vegetable garden. Owen worked tirelessly mending fences overseeing the cattle and riding the range to ensure none of his herd wandered off. The ranch wasn't large, but it was enough to keep 2 sets of hands busy from sunup to sundown. One morning, while cleaning the tack in the barn, Beatrix heard a wagon rattle up the main road. She froze, her heart pounding. Memories of Clayton's enraged face returned, making her break into a cold sweat. But as she peered through a gap in the barn door, she saw that the visitor was an older gentleman. Owen emerged from the house, greeting him with a hearty handshake. The man handed Owen a parcel likely supplies or mail. The name Mr. Travers faintly reached her ears. She remembered Owen mentioning the man owned a ranch to the north. Relief washed over her, mixed with a twinge of guilt. Was she doomed to live in constant fear? A few days later, she gathered the courage to ride into Mesquite Bend with Owen. He needed to purchase new fence posts from the local lumber yard, and they agreed it was better if she had some freedom rather than remain hidden away forever. They left at dawn, traveling by wagon. Beatrix wore a wide-brimmed bonnet and kept her face down, hoping not to be recognized. The dusty main street of Mesquite Bend bustled with wagons, riders, and a few cowhands lingering outside the saloon. A general store stood next to a small church, and further down, a blacksmith's forge clanged with activity. Despite the normalcy, Beatrix's nerves wound tighter with each jostle of the wagon. She gripped the seat until her knuckles turned white, expecting at any moment to see Clayton or one of his ranch hands lurking in the crowd. But they made it to the lumber yard without incident. Owen hopped down, tipping his hat. I'll get the posts loaded. Why don't you visit the mercantile and pick up what you need for the week's provisions? She nodded, stepping onto the boardwalk with her basket. Trying to move calmly as though she had every right to be there, she slipped inside the mercantile. Shelves lined with flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples greeted her. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Finch, bustled in the back. The bell above the door jingled. Beatrix stiffened, bracing herself. A woman in a calico dress stepped in, glancing around. After a quick nod of greeting, she went about her shopping. Beatrix forced herself to breathe. No one paid her much heed. She gathered her supplies, coffee beans, salt, a bit of rice, a spool of thread. For a moment, she felt almost normal, like any other customer in town. She was about to pay when the door jingled again. 2 men entered, dust swirling around their boots. Their spurs clinked ominously. Beatrix's blood turned to ice. One man was tall and lanky, with a drooping moustache. The other was broader, wearing a dark vest and a scowl that could sour milk. Clayton's ranch hands. Beatrix ducked behind a shelf, heart pounding so loudly she feared they would hear it. The men approached the counter, tipping their hats to Mrs. Finch. "Afternoon, ma'am," said the tall one. "We're looking for someone." "A woman. She's gone missing from the Sutter Ranch. Perhaps you've seen her. Beatrix's lungs constricted." She crept closer, inching between rows of tins, trying to remain hidden. Mrs. Finch frowned. "Missing, you say? My goodness, I've not seen any unfamiliar women about, but I don't keep track of everyone who comes in. Is she in trouble?" The second man grunted. "She's run off. Mr. Sutter wants her back. He's offering a reward for information." A chill ran down Beatrix's spine. If these ranch hands recognized her, or if anyone so much as whispered her location to Clayton, all would be lost. Mrs. Finch pursed her lips. "Well, I'd advise your Mr. Sutter to check the local sheriff if he believes there's wrongdoing. As for me, I haven't heard anything." "Reckon we'll keep asking around," the tall man said, doffing his hat. "Much obliged." The men turned to leave, scanning the store. Beatrix shrank further behind the shelf. She forced herself not to move, not to breathe, until she heard the bell jingle and the door close behind them. Moments later, she paid Mrs. Finch and hurried from the store with her provisions, sweat beading on her forehead, despite the mild spring air. Outside, she spotted Owen loading fence posts. She rushed to the wagon, her face pale. "Let's go," she murmured, her hand trembling as she handed him the basket. "Please now." Owen caught her expression and didn't hesitate. He helped her up and snapped the reins, guiding the horses out of town. Only when they were on the open road did he speak. "What happened?" She told him about the ranch hands. Owen's face darkened. "Then he's definitely searching for you." Beatrix's voice shook. "I can't stay at your ranch forever. They'll figure it out eventually. Maybe I should try for Tombstone or some other distant place." He pressed his lips together, glancing at her. "Running might not be your best option. If you run again, you'll always be looking over your shoulder. Sometimes, standing your ground is the only way to end a threat." She stared at her clenched hands. "How? If he's got influence, who will believe anything I say? Maybe the local sheriff. Or we can get proof of what he's done. Letters from people who've seen his cruelty. Folks who know the truth." "You're not alone, Beatrix." A part of her longed to believe him. Another part remembered the power Clayton wielded, how easily he charmed others. "I'm afraid," she said simply. Owen reached over gently, placing his hand atop hers. "I know. But you've got me in your corner now. We'll figure this out." Word traveled fast in small towns. It wasn't long before more people learned that Clayton Sutter was hunting for his missing wife. A few had spotted a woman resembling Beatrix with Owen Barnett, but none had spoken out yet. Rumors began to swirl that Beatrix Sutter had run off with another man, fueling gossip at the saloon and the boarding house. Owen bristled at the insinuation. People always assume the worst, he muttered to Beatrix one afternoon. If they only knew. "Let them talk," Beatrix said quietly, eyes rimmed with sadness. "I'd rather they think that than discover the truth." Still, the rumors carried risk. The more folks gossiped, the more likely the news would reach Clayton's ranch hands. In response, Owen began forging alliances. He spoke with the local sheriff, a stoic man named Alan Richter, who'd come west after serving in the army. Although sympathetic, the sheriff admitted he had no authority to act against Clayton without a formal complaint or concrete evidence. Owen also discreetly reached out to Miss Harriet Campbell, a schoolteacher who had once boarded with the Sutters. Harriet had witnessed one of Clayton's violent outbursts. Though she'd never told anyone, Harriet confided her suspicions to Owen. She believed Beatrix had been suffering in silence for a long time. Encouraged, Owen and Beatrix decided to collect testimonies from those who had glimpsed Clayton's cruelty. Miss Campbell wrote a letter detailing what she'd seen. Old Mrs. O'Leary, who lived next door to the Sutters, recounted nights when she heard Beatrix's muffled cries through the walls. Even the local blacksmith recalled how Clayton threatened him over a late horseshoe fitting. Each statement was carefully written, signed, and folded away. If they could muster enough witnesses, perhaps the sheriff would bring charges, or at least intervene to protect Beatrix. But forging a case in the Wild West wasn't so simple. There was no guarantee the sheriff or a circuit judge would side against a wealthy rancher. And time was running short. Clayton wasn't the type to wait for the law. About a month into Beatrix's recovery, as the midday sun scorched the Barnett ranch yard, a lone rider approached. Owen was out by the corral checking on a skittish mare while Beatrix was hanging laundry. She spotted the rider first. Clad in a dusty grey coat, face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the figure ambled toward the house. Her heart kicked into overdrive. Could it be one of Clayton's men? She hurried to find Owen pressing a trembling hand to his arm. He narrowed his eyes, stepping forward as the rider dismounted. "Something I can do for you," Owen called out. The rider lifted a hand in greeting and removed his hat, revealing a tired but kind face. "Howdy, name's Samuel Radcliffe. I'm with the Pinkerton Detective Agency." Beatrix's eyes widened. Pinkertons were famous for tracking down outlaws, robbers, and anyone with a price on their head. Why would one come here? I heard talk in Mesquite Bend that Mr. Clayton Sutter was searching for a missing wife, Radcliffe said, leaning his forearm on the saddle horn. "I'm investigating a case that may be related." Owen and Beatrix exchanged alarmed glances. She stepped back, uncertain whether to run inside or stand her ground. Radcliffe seemed to notice her reaction. "Ma'am, I mean you no harm. I'm here because Mr. Sutter's name has come up in an ongoing inquiry about land fraud and intimidation. Some folks suspect Mr. Sutter's been forcing neighbors off their property or scaring them into selling at below value. Pinkerton's been hired by certain parties interested in that land." Owen folded his arms. "I see. And what do you want from us?" Radcliffe cleared his throat. "I've heard rumors that Mrs. Sutter was a victim of his harsh methods. If she's here, and if she's willing to talk, I'd like to gather testimony that might help build a case. If we can prove Mr. Sutter used violence to coerce or extort, we can bring him down. But I'll need more than rumors." Beatrix's heart pounded. She yearned to see Clayton brought to justice, but fear clenched her throat. "He's a dangerous man," she said quietly, stepping forward. "He won't hesitate to hurt anyone who stands in his way." Radcliffe nodded, his gaze compassionate. "Ma'am, you're not the only one he's harmed. Think of the ranchers he's threatened, or those who lost their land. If we work together, we might ensure he never does this again." She trembled, remembering the nights of terror. Owen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. "All right," she whispered. "I'll give you a statement. But you have to promise you'll protect me. Because once Clayton learns I'm speaking against him, he won't stop until—" She didn't finish the sentence. Radcliffe's jaw tightened. "You have my word, I'll do everything in my power. The Pinkerton Agency works with local law enforcement too, so you may have more protection than you think." That afternoon, they sat around Owen's small table. Beatrix recounted her experiences in detail, painfully dredging up memories of Clayton's abuse, both physical and emotional. Radcliffe took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. After hours of recounting, Beatrix felt drained. Yet for the first time, she sensed a glimmer of hope. Maybe with enough evidence, Clayton wouldn't simply face rumors he might be brought before a judge. When they concluded, Radcliffe stood carefully folding his notes into a leather satchel. "I'll gather further evidence," he said. "If all goes well, we can secure an arrest warrant. But until then, keep a low profile. Mr. Sutter has many eyes in this region." With a polite tip of his hat, Radcliffe rode away. Beatrix watched him until he disappeared over the horizon. A flutter of anxiety and determination coexisted in her chest. She leaned against Owen, who slid an arm around her shoulders protectively. "We've got allies," Owen murmured. "We're not alone anymore." Despite the scorching heat, Beatrix felt a tremor of cold fear. Allies or not, they still had to wait for the law to catch up with Clayton. In the meantime, she knew he was hunting. Sooner or later, that hunt would lead him straight to her. The confrontation happened sooner than either of them expected. Late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the western sky, Beatrix was in the garden harvesting the last of the summer vegetables. Owen was out by the barn grooming a horse. The ranch was still and quiet. The only sounds were the occasional bellow of a cow and the whisper of the wind through the scrub. Suddenly, dust clouds formed at the edge of the property. Riders approached 234. The hair on the back of Beatrix's neck prickled. She knew who it had to be. She rushed to find Owen, who was already alert, rifle in hand. He ushered her into the barn, urging her to take cover. "Stay back," he commanded. "If things turn ugly, don't come out until it's safe." Beatrix pressed herself against the rough wooden planks, heart hammering. Through a gap, she watched the riders approach. Clayton Sutter was at the forefront, dressed in a dark, tailored vest, with a black hat pulled low over his eyes. The men behind him were the same ranch hands who had searched the mercantile, plus another hulking brute with a thick beard. Barnett Clayton's voice carried over the yard. "I know you're here." Owen stepped into view, the rifle held loosely, but unmistakably ready. "Afternoon, Mr. Sutter. Something I can do for you." Clayton's lips curled into a sneer. "You can hand over my wife, that's what. I got word she's been spotted in town with you. And I know you've been sniffing around, telling folks all sorts of nasty rumors about me." Owen's voice remained calm, though Beatrix could sense the tension in every syllable. "I've told folks only the truth. As for your wife, she's here of her own accord. You got no right to come onto my land demanding anything." One of the ranch hands shifted in the saddle, resting a hand on the butt of his revolver. Clayton barked a laugh. "My wife is my property, Barnett, and you're harboring a thief. She stole from me valuable coins and personal belongings." Beatrix's blood boiled. She had taken only her own savings and the watch from her mother. But she knew how Clayton twisted facts. Owen raised the rifle a fraction. "I'll have to ask you to leave Sutter. Law says a man can defend his land against trespass." Clayton's grin vanished. "I told you to mind your business, Barnett. Now you've gone and made it personal." He raised a hand, and his men dismounted, spreading out. The sound of revolvers cocking sent panic coursing through Beatrix. Owen lifted his rifle to his shoulder finger, steady on the trigger. "I don't want to fight, but I won't back down either." Clayton spat on the ground. "Then you're a fool." Time slowed. Beatrix watched paralyzed as the men fanned out. One man approached from Owen's flank, another from the right. Owen pivoted, keeping his aim shifting between them, but he was outnumbered. Shots rang out. The muzzle flash from a revolver lit the twilight. Owen dropped to one knee, returning fire. Wood splinters flew as bullets smacked into the barn and fence posts. The horses whinnied and bucked. Beatrix's heart lurched into her throat. She couldn't cower in the barn while Owen fought for her life. Gritting her teeth, she dashed to the tack room, grabbing Owen's spare revolver. Her hands shook as she loaded it. "I have to help." She slid open the barn door a crack. Owen was pinned behind a water trough, exchanging shots with two men. Clayton and the bearded brute were advancing from the side rifles at the ready. Summoning her courage, Beatrix crept along the barn's exterior, seeing the shadows as cover. She leveled the revolver at the bearded man, exhaling a shaky breath, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil almost knocked her backward. The bullet clipped the man's shoulder. With a howl, he staggered, dropping his rifle. He whipped around, eyes wild, spotting her in the gloom. "You," he snarled, fumbling for his sidearm. Owen seized the moment to fire a shot that grazed the brute's leg, sending him crumpling to the ground. 2 others were already wounded, and the 3rd man turned tail, sprinting for his horse. That left Clayton. Clayton stepped out of cover, revolver in hand, eyes fixed on Beatrix like a predator. His expression was a horrifying mix of rage and triumph. "You just can't stay away, can you, B?" he growled. "Had to drag another man into your mess, always stirring trouble." Beatrix gripped the revolver, trying to steady her aim. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling. He took another step. Owen, pinned down by the trough, tried to get a shot off, but Clayton was too quick. He fired at Owen, who barely managed to duck. The bullet ricocheted, tearing into the trough. Clayton returned his gaze to Beatrix, raising his revolver. Time seemed to freeze. Then the deafening roar of a gunshot split the air. Clayton staggered, dropping his weapon. A dark stain spread across his shirt. For a moment he stared down at the wound, disbelief in his eyes. Behind him stood Owen, clutching his rifle muzzle, still smoking. He had managed to line up the shot from his cover. Clayton collapsed to his knees, blood bubbling at his lips. Beatrix rushed forward, revolver still clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. She felt no triumph, only an overwhelming surge of relief and revulsion at the violence. Clayton's eyes flickered to hers. His lips parted as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. His body slumped to the ground. Dazed Beatrix stared at her fallen husband. At that moment, the last vestiges of her old life shattered, replaced by a swirling maelstrom of sorrow and release. Owen dropped his rifle, gathering her into his arms. She clung to him, trembling as the sun's final rays died in the west. In the silence that followed, the only sound was her ragged sobs echoing in the desert twilight. The next few days unfolded in a haze of motion and memory. The barn still smelled of gunpowder. Bullet holes marked the trough and fence posts like scars on a battlefield. Beatrix walked the property slowly that morning, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, taking in the wreckage of the storm that had passed. Only this time, the storm had a name, Clayton, and he was gone. Sheriff Alan Richter arrived by midday, riding in with a posse of 4, and Samuel Radcliffe close behind. The Pinkerton detective dismounted and greeted Beatrix with a firm but respectful nod. "We heard," he said gravely. Word reached town not long after the shots did. Owen stood beside her on the porch, silent and steady. He hadn't let her out of his sight since the shootout, but neither had he hovered. His presence was a quiet comfort, like a wall that stood firm behind her as the wind howled. Sheriff Richter inspected the barn, asked questions, and took careful notes. He examined the spent shells and tracked where each bullet had struck. Beatrix provided her statement first, her voice trembling only once when she described the moment Clayton raised his revolver at her. Radcliffe added the testimonies he had gathered, affidavits from neighbors, school teachers, blacksmiths, anyone who had witnessed Clayton's violent streak. "This man," he said, spreading the documents across Owen's kitchen table, was no pillar of society. He bullied half the county and silenced the rest. Even with overwhelming evidence, Richter followed the letter of the law. He questioned Owen thoroughly, ensuring there was no doubt that the gunshot had been in self-defense. "We'll hold an inquiry," he said, "but with what I've seen and what you've both shared, I suspect this'll be closed quickly." Beatrix watched them ride off hours later, leaving dust curling in the fading light. She stood at the edge of the porch until the riders became silhouettes against the horizon. "He's really gone," she whispered. Owen stepped beside her, placing a calloused hand on her back. "He can't hurt you anymore." She nodded slowly, but the truth didn't settle right away. It didn't feel like triumph. There was no celebration. Only a weight finally lifted, but one that left an aching space behind. That night, Beatrix lit a lantern and stood in front of the small mirror above the wash basin. She unwrapped the bandage from her shoulder and examined the scar. The pink ridge of healing skin was harsh, raw, but it was part of her now. It was a mark not of pain, but of survival. She traced the scar with trembling fingers. "You did this," she murmured, imagining Clayton's voice, the look in his eyes, the crack of the gun. "But I lived." She rewrapped the wound and stepped out at, drawn by the cool desert air. The stars spilled across the sky like lanterns, scattered by a generous hand. She sat on the porch knees, pulled to her chest, and let the silence soothe her. Owen joined her moments later, his mug steaming in the cold. They didn't speak for a while. Then softly he asked, "What are you thinking?" "I'm free," she said the words, feeling foreign on her tongue. "And I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. I don't even know who I am anymore. Without the fear, without running, who am I?" Owen didn't rush to answer. He simply nodded, understanding. "You're someone who's still standing. That's where it starts." The next few days brought more clarity. The townspeople of Mesquite Bend, once reluctant to speak against Clayton, began changing their tune. Stories surfaced of intimidation, threats, debts, manipulated neighbors forced to sell land for pennies. The man who had presented himself as a respected rancher now lay exposed as a tyrant. The inquiry was brief. With Radcliffe's testimony and the sheriff's findings, Owen was cleared of wrongdoing. The death of Clayton Sutter was ruled a case of justified defense, both of property and of life. Beatrix sat through the hearing with a quiet strength that surprised even her. She answered questions with composure, refused to let the whispers shake her. When it was done, she didn't feel vindicated, just released. Later that week, she received a letter from Clayton's lawyer. It was short and cold, informing her that her husband's estate had been seized to repay debts. There would be no inheritance, no legal battle, no claim to anything he once owned. She felt no grief, only resolve. She handed the letter to Owen without ceremony. "Let it go with him," she said. He read it, then folded it neatly and dropped it into the hearth. The flames took it quickly, curling it into ash. "You still have a home here," he said quietly. She nodded. "And now I get to choose it." For the first time, that choice felt like her own. Winter came gently to the Arizona Territory that year, brushing the desert plains with soft winds and laying a powdery veil of snow over the mountains in the distance. For the first time in years, Beatrix didn't dread the change in season. The cold no longer mirrored the fear that had lived in her bones. Now it felt like a reset, a quiet exhale after years of holding her breath. The sun rose slowly over the Barnett Ranch, casting long golden rays across the frost-laced earth. Inside the warm cabin, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the aroma of baking bread. Beatrix stood by the window wrapped in a wool shawl, watching the light climb the peaks. Behind her, Owen moved quietly, his footsteps, a comforting rhythm in the early morning hush. Since the shootout with Clayton, The ranch had grown even quieter. The scars of that night still lingered in the bullet-pocked trough, the half-rebuilt barn door. But they were slowly fading into memory. Sheriff Richter's final verdict of self-defense had given them legal freedom, but it was the emotional release that meant the most to Beatrix. She no longer startled at footsteps. She no longer checked over her shoulder before walking outside. "I'll check the herd this morning," Owen said from the table, lacing his boots with slow precision. "We had a bit of fence down by the East Arroyo. Just want to make sure no stragglers wandered too far." Beatrix nodded. "I'll ride with you. I need the air." He looked up surprised for only a moment before a soft smile crept across his face. "Glad to have you." They saddled their horses in companionable silence. Daisy, her mare, was healthy again, her coat sleek and her eyes bright. Beatrix rubbed the horse's nose with affection, whispering a quiet thank you to the creature who had carried her through fire and shadow. As they rode out onto the range, the sky overhead shifted from pale lavender to brilliant blue. The desert shimmered its vast expanse, both harsh and healing. The crisp wind nipped at their cheeks, but the sunlight brought warmth and clarity. They paused atop a small hill overlooking a cluster of grazing cattle. Beatrix sat back in her saddle, her gloved hands resting lightly on the reins. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze run through her hair. "I didn't think I'd ever feel this again," she murmured. Owen turned toward her, his expression quiet and steady. "What's that piece?" She opened her eyes, gaze sweeping the horizon. "I thought I'd forgotten what it felt like." He reached over, placing his hand gently over hers. "You've earned it." She turned to him, eyes shining. "So have you." Their silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds meaning, the kind that speaks without needing sound. Beatrix studied Owen's face, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the sunburned skin, the way he looked at her as if she mattered. She was no longer a burden or a problem to be fixed. She was someone who had survived, someone who had become more than her pain. They continued down toward the pasture, checking the fence line and counting heads. A few cattle had strayed farther than expected, and together they nudged them back toward the main herd. Beatrix moved with confidence, now her body stronger, her balance more sure in the saddle. Owen watched her with quiet pride, letting her take the lead. Later that afternoon, they returned to the cabin, the sun beginning its slow descent. Beatrix carried a basket of eggs from the coop, while Owen chopped kindling near the woodshed. The normalcy of it all settled into her, like warm bread after a long famine. This was life. Not survival. Living. As evening fell, they shared supper by lantern light. Beatrix had cooked stew with dried herbs and wild carrots she'd foraged herself. Owen had repaired the latch on the front door. These small things, these domestic rituals felt like laying bricks in the foundation of a future neither of them had dared hope for. Later, as they sat before the fire, Beatrix leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I used to think love was control, possession. What Clayton offered me," she said quietly. And now Owen asked. She pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. "Now I know it's protection without ownership. It's choosing someone and being chosen back." He nodded slowly, his hand finding hers. "Bae," he whispered, "whatever road you want to walk, I'll walk it with you." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of joy. "And I'll never walk it alone again." Outside, the wind swept across the land, carrying away the last whispers of her old life. Inside the cabin, two souls leaned into one another, not to escape pain, but to build something beyond it. A ranch, a life, maybe even a family. It was all possible now. A new dawn had risen, and with it, a love no longer marred by fear, but grown from it. And so ends the saga of Beatrix and Owen, a testament to courage, compassion, and the resilience of the human spirit in the unforgiving Wild West. Against desert sun and frontier lawlessness, they forged a life built on mutual respect and hard-won hope. Even though Beatrix's past nearly cost her everything she discovered, that true love and kindness could bloom even in the most barren soil. If this story gripped your heart, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By spreading the word, you help keep these powerful tales of hope and survival alive for others who may need a reminder that there's always a chance for redemption. Stay tuned for more riveting dramas and unforgettable characters right here. Until next time, thank you for listening, and remember to hold on to faith no matter how wild the ride may seem.